Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Are you ready? Close your eyes, lean back, and imagine yourself in the story. Off to sleep in peace. First, please subscribe to my channel. No matter which country you're watching from, please leave a comment. How cowboys survived freezings and cold in the Wild West Part 1. The world they lived in, the myth, the reality, and the merciless cold the American West has been painted in golden light for more than a century. A land of wide open skies, dramatic sunsets, and rugged men on horseback riding free across the horizon. But behind that romanticized image lies a far more complicated truth. The men who drove cattle across the Great Plains, who slept beneath open skies from Texas to Montana, did not merely outlaws and wild animals. They faced something far more patient and far more deadly: the cold, the kind of cold that drops without warning from a clear sky, that turns a muddy trail to iron overnight, that reaches inside a man and squeezes the warmth right out of him before he even realizes what is happening. To understand how cowboys survived the winters of the American West, we first need to understand just how severe those winters could be. The Great Plains is not a gentle place in any season. In summer, the heat shimmers off the grass in waves. In autumn, the wind shifts and something changes in the air. In the air, a sharpness, a warning. And then winter arrives. On the northern range, in territories that would become Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, temperatures regularly plunged 30, 40, even 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That is not an exaggeration. That is not the sensationalism of dime novels. That is weather stations and rancher diaries recorded year after year. Through the latter half of the 19th century, the blizzards of the Great Plains were unlike anything most Americans on the eastern seaboard could imagine. They did not. A morning could begin bright and still, the kind of morning that almost made you forget what month it was. And then, sometimes within minutes, a wall of white would rise out of the northwest, what plainsmen called a blue norther, and the world would disappear. Visibility would drop to nothing. The temperature would fall 20 degrees in an hour. A man caught on horseback 5 miles from camp might as well have been 500 miles away. The cattle drives that defined the era of the open range, roughly 1886 to 1886, pushed manimals across thousands of miles of this landscape, the great trails, the Chisholm, the Goodnight Loving, the Western, wound through rain that offered little shelter and no mercy. Cowboys on these drives were not well-equipped adventurers with specialized gear. They were, for the most part, young men, many of them teenagers. $1 a day in conditions that would be considered inhumane by any modern standard. They survived not through any particular technology, but through hard-won knowledge, community, and a set of practical adaptations that they developed and passed down through experience. This is the story of how they did it. It is a story about clothing and shelter, about fire and food, about horses and instinct, and the particular wisdom of men who had no choice but to learn from the land or die trying. It is also a story about the limits of endurance, because not all of them made it. Some winters, on some drives, men were lost. Cattle perished by the thousands. The winter of 1880 to 1887, which historians would later call the Great Died Up. Between 60 and 90% of the cattle on the northern range and effectively ended the era of the open range forever. Understanding how cowboys survived the cold also means understanding that sometimes they did not. And grappling with why. Part 2. Dressed for survival, the clothing that stood between a cowboy and death. A cowboy's clothing was not a fashion statement. Every piece of what he wore had a function, and when that function failed, when boot wore through, when a coat lost its buttons in the cold, the consequences could be severe. The evolution of cowboy dress is really the evolution of practical survival in a specific environment. And cold weather forced some of the most critical adaptations. The foundation of a cowboy's winter wardrobe was layering, though they would not have used that word. They simply knew that more was better when the temperature dropped, and they dressed accordingly. The first layer was typically a wool union suit, a one-piece undergarment that covered the body from neck to ankles. Wool was the material of choice, not because it was soft or comfortable. It was neither. It was scratchy, it could be heavy, and it was expensive relative to a cowboy's wages. But wool has a quality that no other natural fiber shares to the same degree. It retains warmth even when wet. A cotton garment soaked with rain or sweat loses virtually all of its insulating value. A wool garment retains a significant portion of its warmth. On the open range, where a man might be rained on, snowed on, and drenched in his own sweat all in the same afternoon, that property was not a luxury. It was the difference between life-death. Over the union suit came a flannel shirt, usually wool blended, and over that a heavy canvas or duck cloth jacket, or for those who could afford or obtain one, a buffalo hide coat. The buffalo coat was the ultimate cold weather garment of the 19th century American West. Made from the thick, shaggy hide of the American bison, these coats could be enormously heavy. Some weighed 15 pounds or more, but they were also extraordinarily warm. Bison hide has a natural lanolin content that makes it somewhat water-resistant, and the dense, long fur traps air in a way that it creates remarkable insulation. Army officers, scouts, and ranchers who had access to buffalo coats prized them above almost any other garment. They were, in effect, wearing the same coat that the bison itself had worn to survive winters on the northern plains. By the time the great cattle drives were underway, however, the bison herds were being systematically destroyed. The professional hide hunters who flooded the plains in the 1870s of millions of bison in just a few years. And by the late 1870s, the southern herd was effectively gone. By the mid-1880s, the northern herd was approaching extinction. As buffalo hides became scarcer, cowboys increasingly turned to alternatives. Heavy wool blanket coats, sheepskin-lined canvas dusters, and eventually the commercially produced Mackinaw coat, a thick plaid wool garment that became a staple of cold weather work across the northern tier of the country. The cowboy's hat, that most iconic piece of his identity, also served a crucial practical function in cold weather. The broad brim kept snow and sleet out of a man's eyes and off the back of his neck. Many cowboys, particularly on the northern range, wore a knitted wool cap beneath their hat, or a bandana tied around the hat and under the chin to protect their ears. Frostbite of the ears was a genuine hazard, and men who had seen a colleague lose part of an ear to the cold were not too proud to look ungainly if it meant keeping their ears intact. The hands were perhaps the most vulnerable part of a working cowboy's body in cold weather, because hands had to work. A man who could not handle a rope, could not open a gate, could not reload a rifle, was a man in trouble. Cowboys typically wore heavy leather gloves, often lined with wool, and, in extreme cold, might add wool mittens over the gloves. But gloves and mittens create a dilemma. The warmer the hand protection, the less dexterity a man has. Cowboys developed a practical compromise, wearing mittens during travel and removing them only when specific tasks demanded barehanded precision. The leather itself was often elk, deer, or sometimes the hide of cattle, all of which are more pliable in cold temperatures than many synthetic materials are. The boots get particular attention because they were both essential and chronically inadequate. For severe cold, the classic cowboy boot, with its high heel designed to prevent the foot from sliding through a stirrup, and its narrow toe designed to slip into the stirrup quickly, was not a cold weather boot by design. It was built for the saddle. The leather, while durable, is not naturally insulating. Cowboys addressed this in several ways. They wore wool socks, often multiple pairs, inside their boots. Some applied animal grease to the leather to improve water resistance. In severe cold, some men wrapped their feet and lower legs in additional cloth or gunny sacking before pulling on their boots. Tall leather boots that rose to the knee helped protect the lower leg from snow and wind in truly extreme conditions, when temperatures fell to the kind of lows recorded in Montana winters. Even these measures were often insufficient. Accounts from ranchers and cowboys in the 1880s describe men losing feeling in their toes after hours in the saddle, and the slow, painful process of warming frozen feet in camp. A process that had to be done carefully, with gradual warming, because sudden rewarming of badly frozen tissue could cause damage. Frostbite was treated, when it was treated at all, with snow rubbing, a technique now known to be counterproductive, but which was standard practice at the time, or with gradual warming near a fire. Gangrene from untreated frostbite was not unknown, and some men paid for inadequate foot with toes, or worse. The vaquero tradition, which preceded and heavily influenced the Anglo-American cowboy culture, had its own cold weather adaptations. Mexican cowboys, working the ranges of Texas and the Southwest, had developed a practical relationship with their clothing over generations of working in variable climates. The stirrup, a heavy woven blanket worn over the shoulders and body, provided remarkable versatility. It could be worn as a wrap, used as a ground cover, or even fashioned into a makeshift sleeping bag in an emergency. Many Anglo cowboys adopted versions of this garment, and the heavy wool blanket became a standard piece of kit on the trail, regardless of a cowboy's cultural background. Part 3. Shelter from the storm. Dugouts, lined camps, and the art of finding warmth. If clothing was a cowboy's first line of defense against the cold, shelter was the second. And on the open range, shelter, often a far more complicated proposition. The vast cattle ranches of the West had few buildings. A headquarters ranch might have a main house, a bunkhouse, a cookhouse, and a barn. But the range itself stretched for miles, sometimes hundreds of miles in every direction. And a cowboy working the outer edges of that range might be days from the nearest structure. The solution that emerged over the course of the cattle was the line camp or line shack. These were small structures, sometimes very small, built at strategic points across the range. Cowboys could shelter during bad weather, sleep between nip duties, and escape the worst of the cold. They were called line camps because they were typically positioned along the boundaries of a ranch's range, where riders could patrol the fences and prevent cattle from drifting too far in bad weather. A line camp might be a log cabin, a sod house, built into the side of a hill, or sometimes nothing more than a canvas tent with a small wood stove inside. The quality of line camps varied enormously depending on the wealth and priorities of the ranch that built them. On the great ranches of the northern plains, the XT in Texas, the Swanland and Cattle Company in Wyoming, the Marquis Jim Morris's outfit in Dakota Territory. Some line camps were reasonably well equipped with bunks, stoves, and a supply of firewood and provisions. On smaller operations, a line camp might be a single dark room with a dirt floor, a leaking roof, and whatever the previous occupants had left behind. The dugout deserves special mention as a cold weather shelter because it represented a particularly intelligent and adaptation to the plains environment. A dugout was exactly what the name suggests: a structure dug in the earth, usually into the side of a bank or hill, so that the earth itself formed three walls and sometimes the roof. The front might be framed with logs or sod, with a door and perhaps a small window. The earth is an extraordinary insulator. While the temperature above ground might be plunging towards zero, the earth just a few feet down maintains a relatively stable temperature. In much of the American West, somewhere between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, a well-built dugout with a small fire or stove could maintain a temperature that was mild rather than dangerously cold, even when the wind was screaming across the plains and the temperature outside was far below zero. Dugouts had disadvantages. They were dark, often damp, and sometimes shared by a variety of uninvited wildlife. Rattlesnakes found dugouts attractive for the same thermal reasons that cowboys did. They could flood in spring, but in winter, on the northern plains, a cowout could mean the difference between life and death. Experienced plainsmen understood this, and the tradition of leaving a dugout or line camp stocked with firewood, matches, and basic provisions for whoever might need them next, whether friend or stranger, was one of the unwritten codes of the West. A man who came upon an empty lying camp in a blizzard did not consider himself a thief for breaking in and using what he found there. And a man who left a camp empty of wood and food was considered something worse than a thief. The cowboys' relationship with fire deserves its own examination. Fire was not simply warmth, it was life, and the men who worked the range knew it. The ability to start a fire in wet, cold, windy conditions was a survival skill of the highest order, and experienced cowboys were typically very good at it. They carried matches, lucifers, they were often called, in waterproof containers, sometimes in small tins sealed with wax, sometimes in the band of their hats, sometimes in a rubber tobacco pouch. The habit of always knowing where your matches were and making certain they were dry was drummed into young cowboys by older hands who had learned, sometimes at terrible cost, what it meant to need a fire and not be able to start one. Tinder was gathered and prepared carefully. Dry grass, the inner bark of cottonwood trees, dried dung from cattle or buffalo, all served as fire starters. On the trail, a chuck wagon typically carried a supply of dry wood, carefully covered with canvas to keep it from the rain and snow. The camp cook, often the most important non-management person on a trail drive, was responsible for the fire, and a good cook could start one in conditions that would defeat a lesser hand. The cook fire was the center of camp life, the source of warmth, hot food, and hot coffee, all of which were essential to maintaining the core body temperature and morale of men working in brutal conditions. Tent camps were also used, particularly on cattle drives moving through territory where no permanent structure existed. A canvas tent with a small stove pipe running through the canvas, connected to a small iron stove inside, could create a surprisingly habitable space in cold weather. The stove would burn wood or, where wood was unavailable, dried buffalo chips, the dung of bison, which burns slowly and with reasonable heat. The use of buffalo chips on the treeless plains was not a matter of preference, but of necessity. Trees were scarce to non-existent across vast stretches of the Central Plains, and the millions of bison that had once roamed there had left behind a virtually inexhaustible supply of dried dung. Settlers and cowboys alike lathered and burned it without particular ceremony, and it worked. The role of the horse as shelter is not often discussed, but it was real. In a desperate situation, with no camp in sight and a blizzard closing in, a cowboy might huddle against his horse for warmth, or in extreme cases, might sacrifice the animal, killing it to use the carcass as a windbreak, and, in the direst emergencies, even crawling inside the body cavity for warmth. These were not common occurrences, but accounts exist. The horse was a cowboy's most important piece of equipment, and abandoning or sacrificing one was never done lightly. But survival sometimes demanded exactly that. Part for food, fire, and the body's furnace. How cowboys fueled themselves against the cold. The human body is an engine, and like any engine, it requires fuel. In cold weather, it requires more fuel than usual. because maintaining core body temperature is metabolically expensive. A man working hard in freezing temperatures might need twice the calories he would need on a warm day. The cowboys of the open range understood this intuitively, even if they could not have explained it in physiological terms. They ate accordingly. The foundation of the cowboy diet was beef, which was, given the nature of their work, abundantly available. Well, on the trail, cattle that were injured, sick, or otherwise unfit for market would be slaughtered and eaten. The chuck wagon typically carried dried beans, flour for biscuits, coffee, salt, and lard. These staples, combined with fresh beef, formed the core of the cowboy's diet. In cold weather, fat was particularly important. Animal fat is calorie-dense, and it provides a slower, more sustained release of energy than carbohydrates. The lard that went into biscuits and was used for frying was not just a flavor additive, it was fuel. Coffee was perhaps the most important single substance in a cowboy's cold weather survival kit. It provided warmth from the inside out, a rapid dose of caffeine that could sharpen attention and delay the drowsiness that cold-induced hypothermia can produce, and a ritual of comfort in an otherwise comfortless existence. Cowboys, extraordinary quantities of coffee. Accounts suggest that a working cowboy might consume 6 to 8 a day, black and strong. The coffee was typically made in a large tin pot directly over the fire. Grounds and all, with a cup of cold water added at the end to settle the grounds to the bottom. It was not subtle, but it was hot and it was reliable. The beans that accompanied every trail meal were an unusual, crucial cold weather food, high in protein and complex carbohydrates, cooked with salt pork or bacon fat. Beans provided sustained energy through hours in the saddle. The cook typically start a pot of beans in the morning, letting them simmer all day, so that by evening, it was always something hot, substantial waiting for the men coming in from the cold. The importance of the hot meal at the end of a cold day cannot be overstated. Getting something warm into the core of the body, warming the stomach and through the blood, the internal organs, was a critical part of preventing hypothermia. Dried and preserved foods also played an important role, particularly on long drives or in remote line camps where resupply was infrequent. Jerky, dried, salted beef was a standard trail food, lightweight and calorie-dense. Dried fruit, when available, provided vitamins that fresh food could not supply on the trail. Salt was essential for preservation and for maintaining body's electrolyte balance during heavy physical work. Hardtack, a dense, unleavened bread made from flour and water, baked until almost rock hard, could last for months without spoiling and provided reliable carbohydrates, even if it was famously unpleasant to eat without soaking. The chuck wagon itself was a marvel of practical engineering, designed by rancher Charles Goodnight around 1866. It became the standard mobile kitchen of the cattle drive era. Goodnight modified a surplus army wagon with a hinged tailgate that folded down to form a work surface, with cubby holes and drawers built into the back panel for storing cooking equipment, spices, and provisions. A water barrel was mounted on the side. The chuck wagon carried the tools necessary to feed a crew of 10 to 20 men across hundreds of open range. And Cook, who operated it, was as essential to the drive's success as the trail boss himself. In winter conditions on the northern range, cattle were not being driven, but simply kept on the range through the cold months. The Cook Ranch headquarters performed a similar function. Hot food at regular intervals was not just a comfort, but a genuine health measure. Ranches that maintained their crews through hard winters knew that men who were warm, well-fed, and adequate rest were men who could function effectively when the next storm hit. Men who were cold, hungry, and exhausted made poor decisions, worked slowly, and were far more vulnerable to the cold itself. The body's response to extreme cold was something cowboys learned about through experience. Rather than through any formal medical education, they knew that a man who had stopped shivering in the cold was in serious danger. Though they would not have described it in those terms, modern medicine understands that shivering is the body's mechanism for generating heat through involuntary muscle movement. And then when shivering stops in a cold person, it often means the body's thermoregulatory systems are failing. Cowboys observed that a man who got very quiet, very still, stopped complaining about the cold was a man who needed to be warmed immediately, forcibly if necessary. The treatment for severe cold exposure on the trail was practical and largely correct by modern standards. Get the man off his horse. Get him near a fire, remove wet clothing, and replace it with dry if available. Force warm fluids into him if he was conscious, and keep him moving if he could move. The understanding that warming the core, the chest, abdomen, was more important than warming the extremities was intuitive rather than scientific, but it was sound. A man whose core temperature had dropped dangerously would benefit far more from being wrapped in blankets near a fire than from having his hands and feet rubbed. However much that might seem like the obvious thing to do, Part 5 of The Horse in Winter, the Animal That Made Survival Possible. No account of how cowboys survived the cold the American West can be complete without a thorough examination of the horse. Because the horse was not merely transportation. The horse was partner, tool, alarm system, and in some cases, the literal reason a cowboy was still alive. The relationship between a cowboy and his horse in winter conditions was one of mutual dependence, so profound that the line between the two sometimes blurred. Western horses of the cattle drive era were not the delicate, highly bred animals of the Eastern show ring. They were, for the most part, Mustangs or Mustang cross horses, descendants of the horses brought to the Americas by Spanish explorers in the 16th century, who had subsequently gone feral on the plains and have evolved over generations into a uniquely hardy animal. The Mustang was smaller than many Eastern breeds, typically standing between 14 and 15 hands, with a dense bone structure, hard feet that rarely needed shoeing in the rocky West terrain, and a remarkable ability to find and subsist on sparse winter forage. The winter coat of a range horse was itself a marvel of biological engineering. allowed to grow naturally without the blanketing and climate-controlled stabling that characterize modern horse care. A range horse would grow a thick, heavy coat by autumn that included both a dense undercoat for insulation and longer guard hairs that shed water and snow. The guard hairs slightly curved and have a particular structure that causes them to stand slightly away from the body in cold weather, trapping a layer of warm air next to the skin. This is exactly the same principle that governs the insulating properties of a buffalo robe or a wool coat. The horse had been engineering its own cold weather gear for millennia. Cowboys understood that a well-fed horse in good condition going into winter was a horse that would likely make it through winter. They also understood that a horse that lost significant weight during a cold spell was in danger because fat reserves provided both insulation and energy for thermoregulation. Ranch horses that would be needed through the winter were often in supplemental feed, oats, corn, or hay. Hay, particularly when grass was buried under snow and the horses could not graze effectively. Working horses that were kept in barns or corrals were fed more consistently, while horses turned out open range had to fend for themselves to a greater degree. The horse's hooves presented a particular challenge in winter. Hard-packed snow and ice could ball up inside the concave hollow of a horse's hoof, creating an effect not unlike walking on small balls, unstable, painful, and dangerous. Can ranchers addressed this in several ways. Some horses were shod with winter calks, small projections on the horseshoe, similar to cleats on a boot, that into ice and provided grip. Others were left unshod, as the unshod flexes more naturally and is less prone to ice buildup. Some cowboys greased their horses' hooves with lard or tallow to prevent snow from packing. These were not perfect solutions, and horses fell on ice, sometimes with catastrophic results for the animal and the rider. The horse's instincts were also a survival resource for the cowboys who rode them. Horses have an extraordinary sensitivity to changes in weather and a strong instinct to seek shelter. A cowboy who paid attention to his horse's behavior, the alertness of the ears, the tendency to face into or away from the wind, the preference for one direction over another, was getting real-time weather information from an animal whose senses is far more acute than his own. Stories survive of cowboys who gave their horse its head, loosened the reins, and let the animal go where it chose. In blizzard conditions, when the rider could see nothing and were led safely to shelter that they would never have found on their own, the relationship between a cowboy and a specific horse, what was called his string of horses, the 4 to 8 horses assigned to him for a drive, was carefully managed. Horses were rotated so that no single animal was ridden to exhaustion. A tired horse in cold weather is a dangerous horse. Its judgment deteriorates, its feet become careless, and its thermoregulatory capacity declines. Experienced trail bosses and ranch foremen knew this, and the management of horse herd as important a logistical concern as the management of the cattle, the remuda, the herd of spare horses kept on a drive. was typically managed by the wrangler, usually the youngest hand on the crew, whose job was to keep the horses together, find them grazing, and have them ready when needed. In cold weather, keeping the remuda together and preventing horses from drifting required constant vigilance. A spooked remuda in a blizzard could scatter horses across miles of open country, leaving cowboys afoot in conditions where being afoot was potentially fatal. The loss of horses in a winter storm was not just economic disaster. It was a survival crisis. Part 6. The Gnola that kept alive reading the weather. Reading the land, perhaps the most important survival a cowboy possessed in cold weather was not any specific technique or piece of equipment. It was knowledge, accumulated, transmitted, and constantly refined knowledge about the land, the weather, and the body's response to cold. This knowledge came from multiple sources. From the vaquero tradition that shaped much of early American cowboy culture, from Native American peoples whose survival on the same plains had been refined over thousands of years, from the fur trade mountain men who preceded the cattlemen, and from the painful lessons experience. Reading the weather was a skill that could not be taught by book. It was learned by watching and by listening to older men who had watched longer. The signs of a soaring storm on the plains were numerous and specific. A ring around the moon caused by ice crystals high in the atmosphere was a reliable predictor of weather within 24 to 48 hours. The behavior of cattle was watched carefully. Animals that became restless, that bunched together, that refused to graze and turned their backs to the north, were often responding to pressure changes that preceded a storm by hours. Birds, particularly certain species of prairie birds, disappeared or changed their behavior before major weather events. The smell of the air carried information. A certain freshness, a particular sharpness, preceded cold fronts. The wind direction was critical. On the northern plains, a wind shifting to the northwest was a warning sign that experienced hands took seriously. The color of the sky at dusk and dawn, not simply whether it was red, but the specific quality and distribution of that redness, was read as carefully as any weather instrument. These observational skills were not mysticism. They were sophisticated empirical knowledge, built from thousands of hours of observation and refined by feedback. Either the storm came as predicted, or it did not. The mountain man and trapper tradition that preceded the cattle era had developed an even more intensive relationship with winter survival. Men like Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, and Jedediah Smith had survived winters in the Rocky Mountains that made the open plains look hospitable. Their knowledge of how to read terrain for shelter, how to find south-facing slopes where sun would melt snow and expose grass, how to navigate by stars and landscape features in conditions where all visual references disappeared, percolated into the broader culture of the West. Some former mountain men worked as scouts, outfits, and their practical knowledge was invaluable. Native American peoples of the plains had, of course, been adapting to these conditions for generations far longer than any European or American settler. The Lakota, the Comanche, the Crow, the Blackfoot, and the other nations of the plains had developed sophisticated cold weather survival systems that were the product of thousands of years of living in exactly the environment that was killing cowboys. Their knowledge of plants, of terrain, of animal behavior, of the specific properties of different materials for shelter and clothing. All of this represented a depth of environmental intelligence that no newcomer to the plains could match. The transfer of this knowledge was complex and often unacknowledged. The vaquero tradition that shaped American cowboy culture was itself heavily influenced by indigenous knowledge, filtered through generations of Spanish colonial contact. Specific techniques, the use of particular plants for medicine, the recognition of certain geographic features as indicators of water or shelter, even some elements of horsemanship, made their way into cowboy practice through channels that were rarely documented and frequently obscured by the attitudes of the era. A cowboy who had learned from a Comanche guide how to find shelter in a draw or how to read the behavior of cattle in a storm did not always credit that source. But the knowledge was real, and it saved lives. The oral tradition among cowboys was the primary vehicle for transmitting survival knowledge. Told around campfires and in bunkhouses were not simply entertainment. They were repositories of practical information packaged in narrative form for easy retention. A story about a cowboy who ignored the signs of a coming norther and paid with 3 frozen toes was a lesson about weather reading. A story about a cook who kept his fire going in a wet blizzard by building a proper windbreak first was a lesson about fire management. The storytelling tradition of the West served the same function that it has served in human communities since the beginning of time. It passed knowledge across generations in a form that was memorable and emotionally engaging. The bunkhouse itself, where cowboys spent their off hours and winter evenings, was a crucial institution in this knowledge transfer. Older, more experienced hands shared information with younger cowboys in a relatively informal mentorship relationship. A young man on his first winter on the northern range who asked the right questions of a veteran hand and who listened carefully to the answers might learn in one season what it took others years of painful experience to discover. The culture of the bunkhouse was rough and not always kind, but it was also at its best, a community of men who understood that in the environment they worked in, sharing knowledge was a survival strategy. Part 7. The Gret die up when the cold finally won 1886, AAT87, all of the skills, all of the clothing, all of the knowledge and adaptation that cowboys had developed over 2 decades of working the open range was tested to its absolute limits in the winter of 1806 to 1887. What followed was one of the most catastrophic events in the history of the American West. A disaster so complete that it effectively ended an era. Understanding this winter and what it revealed about the limits of cold weather survival on the open range is essential to understanding the full story of how cowboys lived and died in the cold. The summer of 1886 had been dry. The grass across the northern range in Montana, Dakota Territory, Wyoming, and Colorado was thin and sparse. Cattle that had been pushed onto the range in numbers that exceeded its carrying capacity were going into autumn underweight and in poor condition. The ranchers and investors who owned these cattle were mostly in no position to reduce their herds, having borrowed heavily during the boom years of the early 1880s. The stage was set for disaster, though few recognized it. The first sign came in November, when an early blizzard swept across the northern plains. More storms followed in December. The cattle, without the dense layers of fat they needed and without access to adequate grass, began to die. Cowboys rode out in conditions of brutal cold, temperatures of -30 and -40 degrees Fahrenheit, to try to keep the cattle moving, to prevent them from bunching into ravines and smothering each other, to push them toward whatever shelter and forage the land offered. The worst of the winter came in January 1887. Brief warm spell at the end of December based hopes, but also caused a partial thaw followed by a refreeze. A layer of ice formed over the snow, sealing the grass beneath a crust that cattle could not break through. When the blizzards returned in January with temperatures that dropped to 50 below zero in some areas and winds that drove the cold through any clothing, the cattle were already weakened, already starving, and now unable to access whatever grass lay beneath the frozen surface. Cowboys who rode out in these conditions were taking their lives in their hands. The cold was so extreme that breath froze almost instantly. Eyelashes froze together. Horses' nostrils froze. The leather of saddles and tack became as rigid as iron. Men who were thrown from their horses in these conditions could not immediately remove mortal danger. Some did not make it back to camp. The accounts of cowboys who survived that winter speak of a cold so absolute, so evasive, that it seemed less like a weather tension than a fundamental verse. As though the warmth of summer, however, had been a brief illusion, and this was the true nature of things. The artist Charles Russell, who was working as a cowboy in Montana during that winter, cured its horror in a small watercolor painting that became one of the most iconic images of the American West. The painting shows a single steer, emaciated to the point of skeletal visibility, standing in the snow. Behind the steer, wolves wait. The painting is titled "Waiting for a Chinook," referring to the warm wind from the southwest that sometimes brought relief to the northern plains. A rancher named Stadler had written to his Eastonist partner asking about his cattle and received the painting in reply with no other message. The painting said everything that needed to be said. When spring finally came in 1887, the reckoning was appalling. Estimates of cattle losses across the northern range ran from 60 to 90%. In some areas, the losses were total. Carcasses lay across the plains in their thousands, piled in ravines and along the banks of rivers where the cattle had drifted and died. The smell of rotting flesh permeated the spring air for miles. The financial losses were staggering, and many of the great cattle companies of the northern range went bankrupt or were forced into severe reorganization. But the human cost, while smaller in absolute numbers, was also significant. Several cowboys died that winter. In open conditions, no amount of skill or knowledge could overcome. Others survived with permanent damage, frostbitten fingers and toes that never fully recovered, lungs damaged by breathing extreme cold through long hours of hard riding. The winter of 1886-1887 was the moment when the open-range cattle industry came face to face with its own hubris. The assumption that the West could be worked and exploited indefinitely without regard for its fundamental nature and its limits. The practical response to the disaster was a fundamental change in ranching practice. After 1887, the great open-range operations that had characterized the cattle boom gave way to smaller, more carefully managed operations. Ranchers built more substantial shelters for their cattle, not just for cowboys. I was put up in summer for winter feeding. Carrying capacities were respected at least somewhat more than they had been. The era of the great cattle drives over, finished by a combination of the closing of the open range through settlement, the extension of the railroads, and the hard lesson 1886 to 1880s to 1887 part yet. Life in the bunkhouse community, ritual, and the social architecture of survival. The individual cowboy, solitary, self-reliant, riding alone against the sky, is the image that popular culture has given us. But the reality of cowboy life in cold weather was far more communal. Survival in the northern winters was a collective enterprise, and the social structures that cowboys built around themselves were as important to their survival as any piece of clothing or any fire-starting technique. The bunkhouse was the center of cowboy social life, particularly in winter. On most ranches, cowboys who were not actively needed for outdoor work in the worst weather would be confined to the bunkhouse for days or even weeks at a time, waiting for conditions to improve enough to make outdoor work possible. The men who spent this time together developed a community of unusual intimacy. They slept in close quarters, sometimes 2 or 3 men to a bunk in the coldest weather, sharing body heat. They cooked, ate, and entertained each other in a space that might be no larger than a modern bedroom. The bunkhouse was typically constructed to maximize heat retention. Log construction, with the gaps between logs chinked with mud, clay, or moss, was common. A central iron stove kept burning through the night, maintained a temperature that was, at minimum, survivable, and at best, genuinely comfortable. The stove also served for cooking simple meals when the men were not eating in the cookhouse, for drying wet clothing, and for heating water for the irregular but earnestly appreciated ritual of bathing. The social life of the bunkhouse in winter was rich in certain ways and monotonous in others. Card games, poker, euchre, and various other games occupied many evenings. Music was a significant part of bunkhouse culture. Many cowboys played the guitar, the fiddle, or the harmonica and singing was common. The songs of the cowboy tradition, Home on the Range, the streets of Laredo, Jit Along, Little Dogies, were not simply entertainment. They were a social glue, a shared cultural reference, a way of creating community among men who had come from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. Reading was another bunkhouse activity. Perhaps it's more common than the stereotype of the illiterate cowboy would suggest. Literacy rates among working cowboys were highly variable, but novels, almanacs, newspapers, when they arrived, which might be weeks or months after publication, and the Bible were all found in bunkhouses across the West. A cowboy who could read would often read aloud to those who could not. And the stories, whether of adventure, romance, or religious inspiration, served the same function as the storytelling tradition, creating shared experience and shared knowledge. The cook, the chuck wagon cook on the trail, the ranch cook in the bunkhouse, occupied a position of genuine power in cowboy communities. The cook controlled something that everyone needed desperately in cold weather: hot food. A good cook was respected and even revered, regardless of his other characteristics. A bad cook was a genuine liability, capable of destroying morale in conditions that were already testing everyone's endurance. The importance of consistent, hot, calorie-rich food in maintaining the physical and psychological health of a crew working in extreme cold cannot be overstated. And the cook who provided it consistently was doing survival work as real as any cowboy riding in a blizzard. The hierarchy of the ranch was somewhat flattened in winter, when shared danger and shared confinement brought different levels of the social structure into closer contact. A trail boss who in summer maintained a degree of distance from his crew might find himself spending long evenings in the bunkhouse playing copying stories with the men who worked for him. This was not egalitarianism in any formal sense. The authority structure remained real, was respected. But the intimacy of shared survival had a leveling effect that was recognized and generally accepted. Illness was a particular concern in winter, both because sick men could not work and because the close quarters of the bunkhouse meant that infectious illness spread quickly. The standard medical kit of a Western ranch was minimal. Some patent medicines, perhaps quinine for fever, laudanum for pain, and whatever folk remedies the cook or an older hand might know. Serious illness was a crisis that often meant a long, difficult journey to the nearest town with a doctor. A journey that in bad winter weather could take days and might not be survivable. Cowboys who fell badly ill in a remote line camp were genuinely at risk, dependent on their netmates and attention. Part 9. The cowboy ended accepting risk in the roasts both its death, an abstraction in the world of the working cowboy. It was a presence familiaros in every season, but most particularly in winter. Cowboys who worked the northern range understood, at some level that they might not have articulated in those terms, that they were engaged in an enterprise that regularly asked men to operate at or beyond the margins of human endurance. Some of them would not make it. This knowledge shaped the culture in ways both subtle and profound. The stoicism that is often attributed to cowboy character was not simply a cultural affectation or a product of certain ethnic backgrounds. It was, in part, a functional psychological adaptation to a world in which complaining served no purpose, and in which the expression of fear or weakness could undermine the collective morale that was itself a survival resource. A man who broke down in a blizzard, who panicked and made poor decisions under the pressure of extreme cold, was a danger not only to himself, but to the men who would have to care for him or rescue him. This is not to romanticize the emotional flatness that sometimes characterized cowboy culture. The suppression of fear and vulnerability had its costs, and the men who worked the range were not immune to the psychological damage that comes from living with constant physical danger and watching companions die. But the culture that emerged was one that known at enormous value on competence, on self-reliance, and on the ability to maintain functional calm under extreme pressure. Values that were not arbitrary, but were directly related to the demands of the environment. The treatment of death on the trail was practical, almost to the point of brutality. Who died on a cattle drive was buried where he fell, or as close to it as was manageable. A wooden cross, if wood was available, might mark the grave. A Bible verse, if someone remembered one, might be spoken, and then the drive moved on, because as the captain and stopping was not an option. Dead cowboy's personal effects, his saddle, his bedroll, his clothing, would eventually make their way back to his family if he had any, or be distributed among his companions if he did not. The physical fact of his death was acknowledged and mourned, but the work continued. This relationship with death was not callousness. It was the pragmatism of men who understood that the best memorial they could offer a dead companion was work, though, that the companion had begun, and it was, in its own way, an expression of respect. A recognition that the man who had died had chosen this life knowing its risks, and that his companions honored that choice by continuing to do what he would have done. The specific dangers of cold that cowboys faced, frostbite, hythermia, exhaustion-induced accidents in freezing conditions, were understood in practical terms. A cowboy who had watched a companion lose fingers to frostbite understood the danger in a way that no abstract description could convey. The education in survival that the experienced hands passed to the young was not abstract. It was specific, graphic, and grounded in the actual consequences of failure. This was not cruelty but necessity. In an environment where the consequences of ignorance were permanent and often fatal, there was no luxury of softening in the lesson. Part 10. The legacy, what the cold taught. What it left behind there of the open-range cattle drive lasted roughly 20 years. From the end of the Civil War to the catastrophe of 1886 to 1887, in that brief span, a culture developed that was as distinctive and finely adapted to its environment as any culture in American history. The cold, more than any other single factor, shaped that culture. It separated the men who could learn and adapt from those who could not. It demanded community in a landscape that seemed to celebrate solitude. It imposed on the romantic mythology of the lone cowboy, unglamorous reality of collective survival. The practical knowledge that cowboys developed for surviving cold weather was not lost when the era of the great drives ended. It migrated into the broader culture of ranching, which continued and continues to the present day. Modern ranchers in Montana and Wyoming still deal with brutal winters, still manage horses, cattle through cold that would stop most people in their tracks. The techniques are better now. Synthetic insulation, GPS navigation, motorized vehicles for covering range, satellite communication, but the fundamental principles are the same. Keep the core warm, keep moving. Know the weather, know the land, know the animal you're working with. Get hot food into people. The cultural legacy is more complex. The cowboy has become one of the most powerful symbols in American culture. Exported around the world, film, television, music, and fashion, the image is often a simplification or a distortion. The lone hero of the dime novel, magnificent and self-sufficient, needing no one, but the reality that lay beneath that image, the community of men who shared body heat in blizzards and kept each other's fires going and passed survival knowledge from hand to hand across generations. That reality is arguably more admirable than the myth. The men who survived the winters of the American West did so because they were embedded in networks of knowledge, mutual support, and practical adaptation that allowed human beings to operate in an environment that was fundamentally hostile to human survival. They wore the right clothes because someone had figured out the right clothes. They built their fires in the right way because someone had figured out the right way. They read the weather, some weather because someone had watched it long enough to learn its grammar. And they told each other what they knew. Because in a world where ignorance could kill your neighbor as surely as it killed you, knowledge was not generosity. It was survival. The Great Plains in winter is still what it always was. A place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary danger, where the sky is enormous and the cold is absolute, and the distance between a man and help can be measured in hours or days. The cowboys who worked that land in the latter half of the 19th century did not conquer it. No one conquers a landscape. What they did at their best, in their most capable and community-minded moments, was learn to live within it. They paid attention. They adapted. They helped each other. And they left behind a body of knowledge and a cultural that still echoes across the American West. In the way a rancher reads the sky before heading out on a cold morning. In the way a rodeo cowboy wraps his hands against the January air. In the way the stories still get told around fires on cold nights. Because some knowledge is too important to let go of. The cold of the American West did not break the cowboys who worked it. It made them, shaped them, defined them in ways that the sunny days could not. It gave them their skills and their community and their stoicism and their poetry. It gave them something to survive. And in surviving it, They became something worth remembering, not the myth, not the solitary hero of the dime novel and the Hollywood screen, but the real thing, men and women who worked together in brutal conditions, using everything they knew, everything they could learn to keep themselves and each other alive through one more winter on the open range. That is the story how cowboys survived the freezing cold of the American West. It is a story of wool and hide and fire and coffee and beans and blankets and whispered warnings and hard-won knowledge passed from old hands to young ones in the cold light of a January morning on the northern plains. It is a story about the relationship between human beings and a landscape that demanded everything they had and sometimes did anyway. And it is a story that deserves to be told without the gloss of myth, in all its cold and difficult and occasionally transcendent truth.